Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Danielle Lund and I serve as Associate Director of Digital Engagement at the Alumni Association of Mount Holyoke. The mission of the Alumni Association is to provide diverse programs, expertise, and resources for lifelong learning and connection among our alum community. We have alums registered today from the classes of the 1950s up through the 2020s. It's good to be with you all today. For those who couldn't join in person, we're recording and wish to remind that no other recording is permitted. And then just another small bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have questions throughout, just drop them in the chat box found at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to address as many as we can when we come to the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you don't, a reminder, since we are recording, if you don't want your voice to appear in the recording, please be sure to enter your question in the chat versus raising your hand. We're so happy to have with us today Elizabeth Eiler, an alum of the class of 1994, who presently serves as Associate Director for Site Management and Monitoring at ABVI to share on the timely subject of clinical trials. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thanks so much for being with us. And I know you're going to share a bit more of about yourself in the presentation. So I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. And thank you, everyone, for being here today and taking out a little bit of your day to spend learning about clinical trials or expanding on the knowledge you have. The day after election is a day that has a lot of meaning for a lot of people, so thank you for being here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so hello, welcome to Clinical Trial Professionals, who we are and why we do what we do. As Danielle told you, I'm Elizabeth Eiler from the class of 1994. So very quickly, I wanted to give you a little bit of my background. After graduation from Mount Holyoke in 1994, I moved to Winston-Salem, where I started conducting bench research in a physiology of hypertension laboratory. In 1996, I moved into the clinical side of the Hypertension Center and started work as a study coordinator. In 1997, I left the hospital and moved to coordinating for a private research group which offered multi-therapeutic clinical trials. I started monitoring clinical trials in 1999, working with various pharmaceutical companies and in a number of different roles over the following years. In 2019, I became a regional operations manager for Allergan. In May 2020, Allergan was acquired by AbbVie, and the merger of the two companies brought AbbVie to the 7th largest pharmaceutical company in the world. So that's a snapshot of how I got to where I am now. All right, I'm going to outline for you a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. Whoops. First, we're going to see a little bit about what clinical trials mean to you, what kind of ideas you have about them coming into this presentation. And then second, I'm going to give you highlights from the FDA's history, and then I will describe for you clinical trials and some of the key individuals that are involved in them. And finally, I will talk briefly about COVID-19 research and how this fits into clinical trials and availability. To start us off, I would love to hear from you a little bit about what the words clinical trial mean to you. To do that, I'm using a web site called Mentimeter, and all you have to do is go to this www.menti.com and enter this code 6096017. You can enter 3 responses, and you can reply as many times as you like, and it's going to appear on our screen in a word cloud. So let me know what you think of when you hear the words clinical trial. I'm going to give it a couple of minutes for everyone who would like to be able to participate to do so, and you're going to be able to see them pop up here. So, excellent. Yes. So innovative technology, that one is up there. So that means it's a little bit bigger. It means that a couple more people have put it in there. Trust, risky, yes, both things. It runs the gamut. Clinical trials, what means to people. Science, new treatments, volunteers. Excellent, methodical. Science, there we go. Excellent. Excellent. And as I see, science is the bigger word in the middle. So that's great because it is a very science-based industry, and we're going to kind of talk about how we get where we're going. So thank you very much for that. I totally appreciate that, and we're going to you can keep putting them in there because that word cloud will keep growing, and I will save it at the end. So now I'm going to give you some notable points in the history of the FDA. This is a little bit of a trip of a history lesson because we need to understand how it came to be the organization we know today. There's no way to really understand clinical trials without understanding how the FDA evolved. They've enjoyed a 200-year history, so there are numerous important developments and landmark legal cases that move the organization along, but I simply can't cover them all today with what we have. So the points I'm going to discuss are ones I chose to highlight, or in some cases were maybe more significant. So we're going to start back in 1820. In Washington, D.C., 11 physicians met to establish the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, which was the first compendium of standard drugs for the United States. Moving along to 1862, President Lincoln appointed a chemist, Charles M. Wetherell, to serve in the new Department of Agriculture. This was the beginning of the Bureau of Chemistry, which was the predecessor to the Food and Drug Administration. Skipping forward to 1906, the Pure Food and Drugs Act is passed by Congress on June 30th and signed by President Theodore Roosevelt. This act prohibited the interstate commerce in misbranded and adulterated foods, drinks, and drugs. One of the events contributing to this was 12 government-sponsored volunteers, known as the Poison Squad, who consumed food laced with toxic additives such as borax and salicylic acid. These scientific experiments on food using human subjects were really unsustainable. That same day, June 30th, the Meat Inspection Act was also passed. This was driven largely by the shocking disclosures of unsanitary conditions and dyes in foods and cure-all claims for worthless and dangerous patent medication. Many of the issues from the meatpacking industry were brought to light in Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruling in U.S. versus Johnson stated that the 1906 Food and Drug Act does not prohibit false therapeutic claims, but only false and misleading statements about the ingredients or identity of a drug. Therefore, as a result, in 1912, Congress enacted the Shirley Amendment to overcome the ruling of U.S. versus Johnson. The Shirley Amendment prohibited labeling medicines with false therapeutic claims intended to defraud this purchaser. This was a standard that even with this ruling was still very difficult to prove. An example of this was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. In 1845, druggists Jeremiah Curtis and Benjamin Perkins of Bangor, Maine, came together to manufacture this remedy. The story is that Curtis's mother-in-law, Charlotte Winslow, created the formula while she was a nurse caring for infants. Like many of the medicines available at the time, Curtis and Perkins claimed it was a surefire for teething pain and other infant ailments. As you can see on your screen, their advertising was really attractive to consumers. It presented an idyllic domestic image of a mother with her children. However, the two primary ingredients in Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup were morphine and alcohol. It wasn't really surprising that the syrup relieved pain and diarrhea, since a common side effect of opioid use is constipation. A court summary from 1868 shows Curtis reported selling more than 1.5 million bottles of this remedy annually. Throughout the 1800s, the ingredients did not have to be listed on product labels, so many consumers were unaware of the contents of the remedies they purchased. This product was denounced by the American Medical Association in 1911, but continued to be sold as late as 1930. Now we'll move to 1927. The Bureau of Chemistry is reorganized into two separate entities. Regulatory functions are located in the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, and non-regulatory research is located in the Bureau of Chemistry and Soils. In 1930, the name of the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration is shortened to Food and Drug Administration, FDA, under an Agricultural Appropriations Act. So understand now that the next three events on the timeline are all intricately tied together. In 1933, the FDA recommends a complete revision of the now obsolete 1906 Food and Drugs Act. The first bill is introduced into the Senate, launching a 5-year legislative battle. 1937 brought about what was known as the Sulfonilimide Disaster. The elixir of sulfanilamide during the months of September and October 1937 was responsible for the deaths of more than 100 people in 15 states from Virginia to California. Sulfanilamide, a drug used to treat streptococcal infections, had been shown to have dramatic curative effects and had been used safely for some time in tablet and powder form. In June 1937, however, a salesman for the S.E. Massengill Company in Bristol, Tennessee, reported a demand in southern states for the drug in a liquid form. The company's chief chemist and pharmacist, Harold Cole Watkins, experimented and found that sulfanilamide would dissolve in diethylene glycol. The company control lab tested the mixture for flavor, appearance, and fragrance and found it satisfactory. Immediately, the company compounded a quantity of elixir and sent shipments, 633 of them, all over the country. At the time, the food and drug laws did not require that safety studies be done on new drugs. Selling toxic drugs was undoubtedly bad for business and could damage a firm's reputation, but it was not illegal. Because no pharmacological studies had been done on the new sulfanilamide preparation, Watkins failed to note one characteristic of the solution. Diethylene glycol, a chemical normally used as antifreeze, is a deadly poison. Finding people who received bottles from the shipments was exceedingly difficult due to incomplete records or sometimes no records at all. It might say Mrs. Watkins, 2 bottles with no address, no contact information. Through the dogged persistence of federal, state, and local health agencies, the effects of the AMA and news media, most of the elixir was recovered. Of the 240 gallons manufactured and distributed, 234 gallons and 1 pint was retrieved. The remainder was consumed and caused the death of the victims. Then, in 1938, the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act was passed. By the 1930s, it was widely recognized that the Food and Drugs Act of 1906 was obsolete, as we talked about in 1933, but bitter disagreement arose as to what exactly should replace it. By 1937, most of the arguments had been resolved, but congressional action was stalled. Then came the Sulfonilimide disaster. The incident hastened final enactment in 1938 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, a statute that today remains the basis for FDA regulation of these products. As it turned out, the elixir experience did more than hasten enactment of this 1938 act. The new drug section, added to prevent such tragedies, gave the United States a new system of drug control, which provided superior protection while stimulating medical research and progress. In 1940, the FDA was transferred from the Department of Agriculture to the Federal Security Agency, with Walter G. Campbell appointed as the first Commissioner of Food and Drugs. In 1945, the Penicillin Amendment required FDA testing and certification for safety and efficacy of all penicillin products. Later amendments extended this requirement to all antibiotics. By 1983, control was found no longer needed and was abolished. In 1949, the FDA publishes the guidance to industry for the first time. This guidance, Procedures for the Appraisal of the Toxicity of Chemicals in Food, came to be known as the Black Book. In 1954, the first large-scale radiological examination of food was carried out by FDA when it received reports that tuna suspected of being radioactive was being imported from Japan following the atomic blasts in the Pacific. The FDA began monitoring around the clock to meet that emergency. In 1959, the US cranberry crop was recalled just 3 weeks before Thanksgiving for FDA tests to check for aminotriazole, a weed killer found to cause cancer in laboratory animals. Cleared berries were allowed a label stating that they had been tested and passed the FDA inspection. This was the only such endorsement that has ever been allowed by the FDA on a food product. In 1962, thalidomide, a sleeping pill and treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women developed by a German company, is found to have severe birth defects in thousands of babies born in Western Europe. News reports on the role of Dr. Francis Kelsey, the FDA medical officer, in keeping this drug off the US market aroused public support for a stronger drug regulation. This action by Dr. Kelsey was a direct result of the protections put in place 25 years earlier by that 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which now saved the nation from an even greater tragedy. Although accurate figures were difficult to determine, it is widely believed that over 100,000 babies were born affected by thalidomide, and today fewer than 3,000 survive. Also in 1962, the Kefauwer-Harris Amendment, or the Drug Efficacy Amendment, was the amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that was signed into law by President John F. Kennedy. It was a direct response to the understanding of how significant the risks were as spotlighted by that thalidomide tragedy. The new authorities given to the FDA by the Kefauwer-Harris Amendment were the requirement that manufacturers prove the effectiveness of drug products before they go on the market and afterwards report any serious side effects. The requirement that evidence of effectiveness be based on adequate and well-controlled clinical studies conducted by qualified experts. Study subjects would be required to give their informed consent. It gave the FDA 180 days to approve a new drug application and required the FDA approval before the drug could be marketed in the United States. It also mandated that the FDA conduct a retrospective evaluation of the effectiveness of drugs approved for safety, but not for effectiveness, between 1938 and 1962. It allowed the FDA to set good manufacturing practices for industry and mandated regular inspections of production facilities. It transferred the FDA control of prescription drug advertising, which would have to include accurate information about side effects. And lastly, it controlled the marketing of generic drugs to keep them from being sold as expensive medications under new trade names. Moving on to 1966, the Child Protection Act enlarges the scope of the Federal Hazardous Substances Labeling Act to ban hazardous toys and other articles which outright labeling warnings could not be written. Oops. And then in 1970, the FDA requires the first patient package insert that oral contraceptives must contain information for the patient about specific risks and benefits. In 1972, the over-the-counter drug review began to enhance the safety, effectiveness, and appropriate labeling of drugs sold without prescription. In 1977, the Saccharin Study and Labeling Act was passed by Congress to stop the FDA from outright banning the chemical sweetener and instead requiring a label warning that it had been found to cause cancer in laboratory animals. In 1979, 3 Mile Island was the site of a nuclear power plant located in south central Pennsylvania. On March 28th, a series of mechanical and human errors at the plant caused the worst commercial nuclear accident in US history. It resulted in a partial meltdown that released dangerous radioactive gases into the atmosphere. In the hours following the nuclear emergency, the FDA contracted with firms in Missouri, Michigan, and New Jersey to prepare and package enough doses of potassium iodide to protect those threatened with thyroid cancer if exposed to radiation. Nearly 250,000 bottles, which was enough for every household in the area, were delivered to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania within 72 hours. In 1981, the FDA and the Department of Health and Human Services revised regulations for human subject protections based on the 1979 Belmont Report, which was issued by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The 1981 revised regulations provide for wider representation on institutional review boards and details elements of what constitutes informed consent, among other provisions. But what was it that specifically drove these changes? Between 1932 and 1972, a clinical study known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was conducted. It was run by the United States Public Health Service in collaboration with Tuskegee University, and the purpose was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. It initially started with 600 men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. The study was conducted without the benefit of the patient's informed consent. Researchers told the men they were being treated for bad blood, which was a local term used to describe several ailments, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. In truth, they did not receive the proper treatment needed to cure their illness. In exchange for taking part in the study, the men received free medical exams, free meals, and burial insurance. Although originally projected to last for 6 months, the study actually went on for 40 years. In July 1972, an Associated Press story about the Tuskegee study caused a public outcry that led to the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs to appoint an ad hoc advisory panel to review the study. The panel had 9 members from the fields of medicine, law, religion, labor, education, health administration, and public affairs. The panel found that the men had agreed freely to be examined and treated. However, there was no evidence that researchers had informed them of the study or its real purpose. In fact, the men had been misled and had not been given all the facts required to provide informed consent. The men were never given adequate treatment for their disease. When penicillin became the drug of choice for syphilis in 1947, researchers still did not offer it to these subjects. The advisory panel found nothing to show the subjects were ever given the choice of quitting the study, even when this new, highly effective treatment became widely used. The advisory panel concluded that the Tuskegee study was ethically unjustified. The knowledge gained was sparse when compared with the risks the study posed for its subjects. In 1972, the panel advised stopping the study at once. A month later, the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs announced the end of the Tuskegee study. It has been argued as the most infamous biomedical research study in U.S. history. The attempt to prevent anything like this from happening again led directly to the 1979 Belmont Report and the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protections. Unfortunately for the Tuskegee participants, it took until May 16, 1997, when President Bill Clinton offered an apology for the Tuskegee experiment. At that time, there were 8 men still alive who had participated in the trial. In 1983, the Orphan Drug Act was passed, which enabled the FDA to promote research and marketing of drugs needed for treating rare diseases. This allowed companies that identify treatment for conditions that do not directly benefit a large segment of the population to pursue them, even though the profits from the sales will not equal the cost of developing the drug. This act could help to provide tax credits for up to 50% of research and development expenses to those companies. It has proven widely beneficial for many patients that suffer from rare conditions. About a quarter of approved orphan drug indications target populations with fewer than 5,000 people. In 1987, The investigational drug regulations were revised to expand access to experimental drugs for patients with serious diseases with no alternative therapies. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992 required drug and biologics manufacturers to pay fees for product applications and supplements and other services. In 1997, the Food Drug Administration Modernization Act was passed, which essentially reauthorized the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992 and mandated the most wide-ranging reforms in agency practices since 1938. Some of the provisions included measures to accelerate review of devices, regulate advertising of unapproved uses of approved drugs and devices, and regulate health claims for foods. In 1999, clinicaltrials.gov is founded to provide the public with updated information on enrollment in federally and privately supported clinical research, thereby expanding patient access to studies of promising therapies. Essentially, this website lists every clinical trial currently ongoing in the United States, but also will list trials from around the world. The FDA doesn't have jurisdiction over other countries, so only those from the United States are required to be listed. Finally, in 2013, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Reauthorization Act is passed. This establishes and reauthorizes certain programs under the Public Health Service Act and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to public health security and all hazards preparedness and response. So we've looked at the FDA, how the FDA came to be the organization that it is today. Now let's shift our focus and look at clinical trials, some of the main players, and how the FDA has oversight of those trials. For the purpose of this talk today, I am focusing mainly on industry-sponsored clinical trials, which are those that are sponsored by a pharmaceutical company or companies. There is lots of great and important research that happens from government agencies, academic institutions, and individual physicians. But again, due to the limited time we have, I have to keep the scope fairly narrow. So when a company wants to conduct a clinical trial, they have to file an investigational new drug application known as an IND that requests FDA authorization to send an investigational product across states for the purpose of use in humans. The IND must be submitted at least 30 days prior to the start of any clinical trial. There are four phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 trials are typically first-in-human trials and are run on a very limited number of subjects. Typically, they are healthy volunteers in a tightly controlled environment. These trials are focused mostly on safety profiles rather than the treatment of the condition, and in some cases, the volunteers may not have the condition under study. Phase 2 trials are again smaller trials, but larger than Phase 1. These participants typically have the condition under study if the drug is for treatment of a condition, or device. Again, device trials run a little bit differently, so I'm kind of keeping the focus mostly on drug trials. But the people in these trials usually don't have any other conditions, so that again, that focus is fairly narrow. The trials are typically looking at efficacy, but also really solidifying that safety profile. Phase 3 trials are typically much larger in the number of participants, and these subjects are often much more in line with the general population that will end up taking the compound. For example, if you're conducting a Phase 2 migraine trial, the patient population they would likely be seeking would be otherwise healthy subjects that suffer from migraines. In a Phase 3 migraine trial, you would be looking for migraine sufferers, but these individuals might also have hypertension, diabetes, or some other type of comorbidity. They would be more representative of the general population. A Phase 4 or 4B trial are typically aftermarket trials that are run. Sometimes these are to look at the same medication in a new indication. Some these are FDA mandated aftermarket trials that are run to obtain some type of long-term safety data. However, Usually following a successful or series of successful phase 3 trials, a pharmaceutical company will submit their data to the FDA to support an NDA, a new drug application. This is a comprehensive document that must be submitted to the FDA to request approval for marketing a new drug in the United States. Most of the time, the FDA will come out and audit the pharmaceutical company and their trial records to ensure that the company has adequate and accurate records and has complied with all regulations in the conduct of the trial or trials. They will usually also visit some of the clinical trial sites and audit their records as well. Well, we've talked about the phases of the trials and how companies progress to submission of their compounds. So now we're going to talk about the parts of a clinical trial. A clinical trial site is any facility that is conducting research for the sponsoring company in a trial. There will be one main physician at the site who is responsible for every part of the research that is conducted there and for overseeing any personnel working on that trial. This individual is known as the principal investigator. At the beginning of the trial, they complete an FDA Form 1572 that is essentially an agreement with the FDA that they understand that they are solely responsible for the research conducted at their site. A study coordinator is the individual to whom the principal investigator delegates some of the tasks of the trial. Most often, this includes seeing the patients at their visits, obtaining their routine vital signs, drawing bloods, dispensing medication, those types of activities. These individuals are delegated these tasks based on their training and skills. They often complete much of the data entry into the case report forms. The case report forms, also abbreviated to CRFs, are where the data from every subject is captured. This data set makes up a large part of the study database and eventually is what is analyzed and sent to support submission of a compound to the FDA. A clinical trial protocol is a recipe book, if you will, for the running of the trial. It provides a background on the compound and then outlines every procedure and activity that is conducted and what the time frame for each will be during that trial. It outlines the subjects that should be included and what will exclude a subject from participation. It discusses labs, ECGs, pregnancy tests, and any other type of diagnostic that might be conducted. If the trial participants will need to complete a diary, it explains what will be collected, how it will be collected, and who will do the collecting. It outlines how the compound under investigation will be stored and how it is supplied. It describes the trial. This could be something like open label or double blind. If it's double blind, well, it will tell you that. So what does that mean? It means that nobody at the site knows what compound a subject is getting. And then the double blind is that both the physician and the trial subject won't know. The protocol will say that subjects are to be randomized into a certain ratio into the trial. So the subject comes in for a screening visit and then is eligible to enter. A randomization system will place them into one of the stratifications. If the placebo compound ratio was 2 to 1, we know the chance of getting a placebo in this trial is 1 in 3. The medication typically has been blinded in some way. This might include an over-encapsulation or some other way made so that it is visually, there is no distinction that you can make between the active compound and that placebo tablet. If the trial is placebo controlled, then the data will be analyzed for the active compound against data from those who received the placebo. As I said before, the physician or principal investigator in a double-blind trial does not know what the subject is getting when they enroll. However, there are safeguards in place so that if the subject experiences some type of event that requires the medical personnel to know what they are taking, the blind can be broken. This is never something that is done lightly because this could have serious lasting implications for data integrity of the study. There are lots of other types of trials that don't involve a placebo, but they could still be double-blind. And these types of trial, often a standard of care compound, so a compound that is already approved and widely used for the indication under study, will be used to compare efficacy with that investigational compound. In these cases as well, the blind is maintained by ensuring that the two active compounds used in that trial will appear visually to be the same. Many trials do not actually use a placebo, while others will. It depends on the kind of trial it is, but also on the condition under study. There are some conditions where it would not be safe to have a patient completely untreated for the duration of a clinical trial. These are all factors that are taken into account when that protocol is written. Perhaps the single most important document for a patient in a clinical trial is the informed consent form. This must be read, understood, and after the subject has all of the questions answered to their satisfaction, they have to sign it, and then it is signed by typically the investigator or a designee. There's some regulations about that too. There are 8 main elements to the informed consent. It must require a description of the clinical investigation. It has to talk about the risks and discomforts that might be associated with the trial, the benefits that the participant might hope to gain, that there are alternative procedures or treatments that might be available to help them for their condition, if those are available, the right to confidentiality, that compensation and medical treatment will be available in the event of an injury. It will include trial contacts, such as the principal investigator, and it often will have a 24-hour contact number. And lastly, the explanation that the subject's participation in the trial is voluntary and can be withdrawn at any time for any reason. Next, the Institutional Review Board, also known as an independent ethics committee, an ethical review board, or a research ethics board. They perform a significant function for a clinical trial. Their purpose is to ensure the rights and welfare of the subjects are protected. This committee is responsible for reviewing and approving any research involving human subjects before it begins and throughout the trial through periodic continuing review. It is comprised of individuals who have scientific expertise, those who have training in non-scientific areas, and members of the community who may represent people who would participate as subjects in research studies. A study cannot begin without approval from the IRB. So next, we're going to look at just a few of the sponsor representative roles. So a clinical research associate is the sponsor representative to the trial sites. These individuals periodically perform both on-site and remote reviews of the data. They are looking to ensure that the trial site is complying with the protocol, consenting the participants appropriately, properly storing and dispensing the investigational compound, and entering their data in a timely manner. There is an acronym, ALCOIC, that they are looking to ensure in clinical trial data. This is that it is attributable. So the person that recorded that data, you can tell who did that. Legible, we can read it. That it's complete, that they haven't left anything off. That it is original being that it's the first place that it was written down. That it is accurate, and that it is contemporaneous. These individuals are usually the main point of contact between the site and the sponsor. The medical monitor is the physician at the sponsor who is an expert on the compound under study. They can speak doctor to doctor for medical questions that the principal investigator might identify during a trial. The clinical team is a misleading name, as it sounds like a group of people who might meet in a small conference room. However, it is far larger than that. The clinical team is made up of a variety of individuals, including data management, safety groups, clinical pharmacology, statisticians, scientific and regulatory affairs, and many others. These teams can be vast, but every individual has a specific and important function to the successful execution of a clinical trial. Okay, now we've looked at some of the many parts to a clinical trial, but why do people want to participate? What do they gain? Many people will enroll in a trial in an attempt to find a better solution to their condition. Let's stick with the migraine example from earlier. If an individual has not gained successful control of their migraines, they might enroll in a trial to find something that would work better and give them more relief. This is probably the most common reason that people will enroll. Sometimes someone will enroll simply because they want to further science and they gain satisfaction from helping out in that way. Sometimes, however, the benefits are a little unexpected. In the early 2000s, I was monitoring an asthma trial in Denver, Colorado. One of the screening criteria for the trial was that the subjects had to wear a heart Holter monitor for 24 hours. This was to rule out baseline cardiac issues, as well as to allow for a comparison to the same test that would be conducted at the end of the treatment with the investigational product. Understand that this was a screening procedure. These subjects had signed the informed consent, but had not yet actually enrolled in the trial to treat their asthma. One gentleman completed the Holter monitor test and had to be screen failed due to cardiac findings. So he actually did not get to receive treatment for his asthma. However, given these findings, he was referred directly to cardiology. The cardiologist told him that the Holter monitor indicated that he was likely facing imminent cardiac arrest. The cardiologist said that he saw few patients like this before their heart stopped. As a result of this clinical trial screening test, this man was able to be taken in and immediately treated. I remember that day how proud I was to be part of that trial, not because we had done anything for his asthma, but because we had improved and lengthened his life. So these are the broad strokes of a clinical trial, some of the key players and aspects. So how can we relate this to our lives right now? COVID-19. It occupies our thoughts every single day, probably more than we would like. So let's talk a little bit about the role of clinical trials in fighting this disease. But please understand that I am by no means an authority on COVID-19 or vaccines. In fact, my company is working on COVID, but not a vaccine because we are not a vaccine company. So this will be a very high level and really looking at applying what I have just discussed. It's also not political in any way. So if you review the clinicaltrials.gov page, you will see that they have links to existing COVID-19 trials on their homepage, making looking for a trial really easy to find. There are currently 51 COVID-19 trials in the US, 26 are vaccine trials, of which 9 are receiving federal funding. In reviewing the 26 trials listed, it seemed that not all of them are simply looking for a vaccine. Several of them are looking at additional aspects. Also, there are some that have been halted. Those that appear to be furthest along by looking at those are listed on this slide. AstraZeneca is currently conducting phase 3 trials. Pfizer is conducting phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. Merck has opened a phase 1 and 2 trial, Janssen a phase 3, and Sanofi Pasteur phases 1 and 2. Many of these trials will be using a data safety monitoring board, a DSMB. This is also sometimes called a data monitoring committee. This is an independent group of experts who monitor patient safety and treatment efficacy data while the clinical study is ongoing. These are often used when a trial poses more than minimal risk to the subjects. Given that so much is unknown about COVID-19 and how quickly someone can become very ill, the speed with which vaccines are needed, these DSMBs are likely to be used frequently, if not always, in trials in an effort to find the safest, most effective vaccine as rapidly as possible. Obviously, speed is of great importance, but the safety and efficacy of a vaccine is vital. In the news recently has been Johnson & Johnson pausing its vaccine trial due to health differences between the placebo and treatment groups. Eli Lilly's trial of a COVID-19 drug had to be paused due to safety concerns. AstraZeneca's vaccine trial has been paused a couple of times after volunteers became ill. But pauses in these trials is actually a good thing. It means that the researchers are following the proper safety procedures. 2 of my management co-workers are currently participating as volunteers in COVID-19 vaccine trials. One of them lives in Connecticut and the other is in Texas. And it's been very interesting to hear their experiences in these trials despite their geographic differences. The good news is that some of these trials are in phase 3, which means we are getting closer to a vaccine being submitted. Once trials are concluded and data submitted to the FDA, they will prioritize review and approval if warranted. Once the approval for a vaccine has been obtained, then the company will have to switch their focus and their resources on producing enough for the population. The government will likely help to facilitate dissemination, but obviously we have no idea at this time how that might look or when it might be available. The research-related bright spot to this pandemic is that companies, universities, and individuals that typically would not have worked together have collaborated on many things since this began in a way that we really have never seen before. The idea of the greater good being more important than baseline revenue or intellectual property has actually been really refreshing. So this is bringing me to the final poll in today's presentation. Given everything that I have told you about clinical trials and how they work, I would like to know how you feel about a COVID-19 vaccine with this information. Do you feel more optimistic about it, less optimistic, or about the same? This actually uses the same polling site as we used before. So if you were already on there, you'll see that it'll say wait for the presenter to move the slide, which I have done. So yeah, here we go. We've got our first result. So I'm intrigued to see, because I know there's a lot of factors into thoughts on this COVID vaccine. So I'm just going to give it a few minutes for people to be able to get there. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, I thank you very much for your input on that. So I have one more final question that I really need to address. Is the last part of the title is, why do we do what we do? Well, I can tell you that each day, the reason I go to work and that most of my colleagues go to work is to help people. We have one major goal, and that is to improve the lives of the patients in this country and around the world living with conditions that negatively affect the quality of their lives. So thank you very much for your attendance and participation today. I've enjoyed this time, and I hope that you have found it was both interesting and informational. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us, for the breadth and depth of the knowledge that you have shared. I know you already dove into a question I had about sort of the sharing of information when there is a crisis such as COVID. So I don't know, that was sort of a positive thing to hear in terms of private and public institutions sharing knowledge to reach a better place with COVID. So I see that we have a handful of questions that have come through. So I will go ahead and elevate those. We encourage you, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll enable you to vocalize the question, or you can drop the question in the chat and I will raise it up. So one of the first ones that we saw come in was, why does the FDA not regulate claims of over-the-counter minerals, vitamins, nutritional supplements, etc.? Is that something that you can speak to?
Actually, I don't really know exactly how that fits in. I just know that they aren't run the same way. Yep. there are certain criteria on them so that we don't get some of the things that we talked about earlier, right? That they have to align with the packaging and everything like that, but they don't play the same role with having to show efficacy and studies like that.
Thank you. And then recognizing that you acknowledged that you're sharing what you know about COVID. A couple of questions have come through, so I'll raise these, and you can speak to your level of comfort and expertise on them. So one came through that why are only 9 out of 51 of the COVID-19 trials receiving federal funding? Are there specific criteria for that?
That literally I pulled from the clinicaltrials.gov website, and I think that you can probably look at that. There are certainly a lot more than 9 companies that are getting funding because they're I mean, I know of a few that weren't listed because they're not working on the vaccine trials right now, but they have been identified as receiving funding. So I think that it depends where it is in the cycle, but I would encourage you to visit that website because I do know that was a hyperlink, and it may be able to give you more and accurate information on exactly what that criteria was.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that as a resource. What's your observation on the type of background sought by your company in the clinical research professionals that they are currently hiring in terms of degrees, experience, etc.?
Well, I will tell you that entry level as a clinical research associate, there's obviously on the clinical side of things, it runs a little bit differently, but the minimum requirement is a college degree. And I would say probably about 10 years ago, we saw this huge drop off as that suddenly became a requirement of people who'd been in the industry 20 years who could no longer actually hold the positions anymore because they didn't hold a college degree. Some of them left the industry, some of them just went back and finished a degree because most of them had been somewhere in that degree cycle but had never graduated. But I will say that this is a career that is unlike many others, excuse me, in that you don't have to come from one unique background to get here. My company typically requires 5 years in the industry, but there are plenty of companies out there that are taking people without experience. However, there are a lot of programs that are coming about. You can get like a master's in clinical trials and things like that. There are advanced degrees that will actually help you to get into the industry. That has changed a lot. There really was no one way into the industry back when I started in the mid 90s. And we find people of all different backgrounds. I've worked with nurses. I've worked with people like myself that have just sort of worked our way up. There's been a lot of on-the-job training, medical terminology, therapeutic training. All of that has happened along the way. So that's in the side that I'm on. There's incredible opportunities for those with PhDs that involves in the clinical teams and things like that. So those with advanced degrees, MDs, PhDs, usually can get in on the other side of things. So,
thank you so much. Are clinical trials involved in the decision to change drugs from prescription to over-the-counter or from brand name to generic at all?
So brand name to generic has a lot to do with the ending of a patent. So when a drug is approved, there is a patent period. And when that patent runs out, then it is able to be produced by a generic drug manufacturer. So that's why you'll see a lot of drugs that when they first come out, your insurance company may not even cover them because they're going to be the most expensive because they've just come onto the market, and the insurance companies a lot of times will want to direct you to a generic compound. However, there's usually caveats. If you've tried those and they haven't worked, usually there are ways to work around that. I will add the note on that to, if there is a compound that you and your doctor think that is important for you and your insurance company has not approved that, I encourage you to visit the website for that drug, because very often when a company releases a new compound, they have all kinds of assistance programs on their website that patients can apply for. So it isn't necessarily the end of the road just because it's new. But anyway, so that moving to a generic happens when that patent comes off. For a compound that is moved over the counter, typically, I believe the rule of thumb is, if I remember correctly, they have to be able to show efficacy at 50% of the dose rate. And if they can do that, then that, and obviously you can't say that with like morphine, but there are some compounds, like I can think off the top of my head, I think is like Zyrtec or some of those allergy ones have come off in the last 20 some years, have gone from prescription to generic. So yes, it's an efficacy at a lower dose rate that can allow that potentially to come over the counter.
Thank you for explaining there. So an opinion question related to COVID, and again, feel free, based on your experience there, to share as much or little as you prefer. So phase 3 of the Oxford AstraZeneca trials were halted when one participant developed a serious neurological condition. They chose to keep their findings blind, even though knowing if the participant had the trial vaccine would have allowed the trials to go ahead. Do you think that was the right call?
I think that given the fact that those trials right now have treated over 8,000 people, and it was one incidence, it would make the risk low. Not that the good of the many is better than the few. However, we do see events a lot of times in clinical trials, and when those events are analyzed, whether it's because it's an unblinded trial and they can see, or when the blind is broken, one of the things is when you have an event that happens in a trial, even in a blinded trial, the investigator has to assess whether or not that event they believe to be related to the compound or device in the trial. So you could say, and so any untoward event that happens to somebody in the course of a trial has to be reported, and it has to be assessed that way. That is an adverse event. You could say in a contraceptive trial, a subject that is, and this is going to be a really extreme example, a subject that is in a car accident and has head trauma and wasn't driving, they would have to look at that head trauma because it is an event that happened in the trial, and they're going to say, yeah, that wasn't due to the birth control or the contraceptive that they were, that they had this head trauma. So obviously that's a really obvious one, but there are several shades of gray in between there, and that is what's being assessed. So given the fact that I don't know that much about the trial and the fact that they had the one participant, my guess is that if that physician said they did not believe that incident was related to study drug, in this case the vaccine, then yes, I think it could potentially be. But what I will say is that if they were to see that happen again, that's when they're more likely to delve deeply into, finding out whether this is now we're starting to see a trend versus a single incidence.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that with the professional lens. Very much appreciated. And so we are coming just about to time here. Elizabeth, I want to thank you again so much. And also apologies for my mispronunciation of your company, AbbVie. But we so appreciate you being here, sharing all your knowledge. The work that you put into this presentation is terrific. And thank you to all who are with us today for your great questions and comments. I am going to right now quickly share in the chat box a link where you can find more of our upcoming virtual events. We'd love to see you all at some of the ones that we have coming up. There's one on handling conflict at home and work next week. Additionally, this semester, we have one on the biology of human skin color. We have one coming up called Everything Financial, What I Wish I Knew Then, specifically for those in the first 10 years of their career, and an alum-led virtual back to class on oil painting. So we hope you'll take a look and stay tuned for the upcoming events. Again, great to be with everybody today. Wishing everybody a good day. And thank you, Elizabeth. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.